Hey all, welcome. Today we're going to discuss Microsoft Azure Management with PowerShell. So who am I? My name is Luke Murray. I'm a Microsoft MVP in the Azure category. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a senior consultant in Hamilton, New Zealand. I work for a company called Datacom, and I run a Microsoft Learn community to help people upskill around Jibber disappointment and answer their questions and mentor Azure Cloud Commanders. So take a, Google search that if interested. So what are we going to look at today? Today we'll be using PowerShell to connect to Azure and modifying crate resources. So what do we need to get started? We're going to need an Azure subscription that you have access to create resources and modify them. So potentially like a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, a Sandbox subscription, something that you have access to create resource groups, create virtual networks into. So contributor access. You'll also need a GitHub account. The reason I say that is because in this demo, I'm going to be using a GitHub code space and a notebook in order for interactive session, so we can run the code and then see the output in the notebook. We'll talk about that shortly, but in order to run the GitHub code space, you need a GitHub account, and the code space is free for X amount of hours, but you could just take what I have, take what I show. I've written a blog article as well, so you can take the snippets from that. You don't need to run through and with a GitHub account, but it's recommended. I think the notebooks are really cool to play with as well. So what exactly am I talking to about code spaces and notebooks? Like, I need a bit more information, Luke. What are you talking about? So a code space is essentially a container that runs on the Azure platform hosted by GitHub, and it gives you your ID, so integrated development environment, that Visual Studio Code. So essentially you go to the Git repo, you click on a code space that runs, and that has predefined and already installed applications like Visual Studio Code. It has some extensions. So in our example, we already have PowerShell installed, so it's ready to go. And then all we need to do is layer on what we need on top of that. So things like the Azure PowerShell modules will install as well as part of it. But it means that you don't need to have anything installed on your computer, and you can delete the code space when it's needed. So the notebook. So computational notebooks that we'll be using was primarily created originally for as part of the Jupyter Notebook project for data analytics and data scientists to use for interactive visualization. What we're going to be using today is not a Jupyter Notebook, which is usually based on Python. We're going to be using something called a Polyglot notebook, which allows multiple different type of languages running on a custom kernel of .NET. So which includes PowerShell, but you can run KQL, you can run PowerShell and JavaScript, you can run HTML, even SQL in these notebooks. And they're really great for interactive documentation, teaching, and independent learning, which is what we'll be using it today. Prototyping, API interactions, machine learning, AI, and running infrequent tasks. So you could use a notebook to create application demos of things. Like you might need to get a count of all the Azure resources you're running. So instead of giving the user the commands to run, you could just give them a notebook. They click a cell that runs the command, and away you go. But you'll see more of how the notebook works as we go through. So let's get started. What you're about to see is hosted on a public Git repo. So it's github.com/LukeMurrayNZ/Azure PowerShell Notebook. So you can go in and run it exactly how I'm going to show you today.
Hi team, I am now at the Azure PowerShell Notebook GitHub repository where I have two notebooks. One is to Azure PowerShell, the other is basic Azure Resource Management. To open our code space, we click Code and create code space on main.
So now we've got the code space open and it's running my notebook. Let's start to delve into it. So PowerShell is a scripting language and automation framework developed by Microsoft. It's designed for task automation and configuration management, and is particularly useful for managing and automating Microsoft environments, but also just about anything that you can have a REST API backend for. You can use PowerShell to deliver it. So PowerShell is command line, and it's built on the dot framework, and it's used a lot in scripting to complete tasks like shutting down VMs, running file copies, things like that. It's really imperative for day-to-day operations when working with Microsoft Azure. So when it comes to Azure, PowerShell provides just a robust set of commandlets that enable you to interact with and manage Azure resources, making it a valuable tool for working across multiple Azure services. When you run a PowerShell commandlet, for example, to create a virtual machine or retrieve information about an Azure resource, the commandlet will translate your request into a HTTP request and then send it to the relevant API endpoint. So you don't need to worry about working with REST APIs or anything like that. The PowerShell commandlet is a layer on top of that that works with the APIs in the background, making it a lot more easier to use, consume, and modify resources. So what we're looking at here is a notebook. So this is an interactive environment that allows us to write and execute code and then view the results. So this is a polyglot notebook, which means that I can use multiple programming languages within the same notebook. An example is this is a .NET interactive notebook running PowerShell, but I could also use the PowerShell commandlets that are run in here could also be used to trigger variables that I could use in SQL scripts and things like that within the notebook. So hopefully you'll see the power of the notebook as we go through this introduction to Azure PowerShell course. Let's get started. So first up, let's get the version of PowerShell that you're running. So a supported version of the PowerShell that you need installed in order to use the latest Azure PowerShell modules is version 7 or higher. So one of the environment variables we can call, which is PS version table, will tell us what version of PowerShell that we're running. So keep in mind, in my example, this notebook is running on a Docker container in a code space, already got PowerShell pre-installed, but we want to check what version it is. So let's run that. So as you can see, hitting the little execute function here will execute this command line as a PowerShell. So as you can see, when I mentioned earlier about using multiple programming types, I could have C# running here. I could have PowerShell code, KQL. I could use Mermaid for graphing, PowerShell, and SQL. But hopefully you can see the power. So the version of PowerShell that is running on the code space is 7.3.6, which is more than enough for what we need. And you can see the operating system, the platform, and the PS remoting protocol version as well. But the key for us is making sure we're above 7, which we are. So next step is to set up for Azure Management by installing the AZ module. So there are a couple of ways to do this. One is to install it manually by just setting the install dash module AZ. So AZ is the set of modules that will be called for Azure administration. And then PS Gallery is where they're coming from there. So that's a PowerShell gallery hosted by Microsoft with approved PowerShell modules that we can just call. So as long as you've got a PowerShell terminal open, you can type in install-module space AZ, and then it will go up and ask you, do you trust this PowerShell gallery that you're now pulling from? Do you have permissions to use it? Example. But because we're running in the notebook environment here, we can't use this one because if we went install-module AZ, it will prompt, do you trust the PS gallery? Yes or no? And I can't interactively give a response to that. It will also list, do you are you happy with the versions of the modules that do you have permission to install them at a system level? And in this case, we don't, because we don't have root access to the underlying VM. So we can't use this, but in this example, if you were running it on a computer, you could go, yes, you could run this and then accept the prompts. But what we're going to do here is install the PowerShell modules as our current user. So what we're going to do is go install module -name AZ, repository is PS Gallery, and the scope is current user. That means we can run them in our current user context without needing local system access. So we're just going to copy across the set. Yes, repository to trusted, and then install it as current user. So let's get started. And so as soon as we run that, that will go through and execute setting the PS Gallery as a trusted repository and installing the AZ modules. So this part can take a couple of minutes, so I'll come back to you once this has been completed. Right, it took 1 minute and 52 seconds for the modules to be installed. If we wanted to, we could use the install module -name -AZ and then add a required version if we were looking for a specific version. For example, I've used this in the past with the latest version of the modules has problems, and so pinning it or installing a specific version can get around that until it's fixed. If we wanted to update the modules, say you've had the Azure modules installed for 3 months and there's a new feature. An example is Azure Elastic-SAN. So Azure Elastic-SAN is in preview at this moment, but as preview gets closer to GA, so generally availability, then the PowerShell modules reflect new features and functions as part of that. So if I wanted to leverage the latest updates to the Azure Elastic-SAN modules, I would need to update the modules. So to do that, I would again set the PS Gallery as trusted, and I would get install module, so get -install module name AZ wildcard, and then I'd pipe it. So the pipe here allows me to pass through from one commandlet to another. So what this is doing is it's getting all the installed modules that I have where the name starts with AZ, so AZ.accounts, AZ-resource, AZ-storage, and then it's piping those modules through to the update module commandlet, which will then allow it to update. If we wanted to know what type of commands we're dealing with, so we've just installed the AZ modules, but what can we actually do with them? So a really good command to know is get command. So get command -noun AZ $, so anything starting with that. So what that's doing is it's getting all the AZ modules, all the AZ commands, the noun AZ in them. So as we can see all the new Azure modules, all the new Azure commandlets that now appear for us to use as part of installing the AZ modules. So we've got some Synapse modules. So we can do new-az synapse dataset to create a new synapse dataset. That's part of the az.synapse module. That was installed as part of installing the AZ module, which was the parent of all these. As we can see, we can now work with Synapse, AKS, IoT, Compute, Network, the resources themselves. So we can get subscription deployments, we can get Azure resource group deployments, recovery services, notification hubs. All these services we can now leverage native Azure tooling and PowerShell commandlets. So if we wanted to know information about Log Analytics workspace keys, we could use the get-az operational insights workspace shared keys, which is now available to us because we've installed the Azure modules. There's quite a lot of Azure commandlets that's been installed as part of this overarching AZ module package. So this can take a while. As you can see, it's still going and going and going. And it's up to Sentinel. You can do role assignments. So while that does that, another really good commandlet out of the box is get help. And then specifying in examples parameter as well. So in this example, get-help, where the name is get-az VM, and then the parameter example. So let's run that. So what that's going to do is give us the help. So in Linux, you've got like man files. So they're the help files for, certain commands that you might run. In PowerShell, it's get help. And then this runs a manifest file, which will allow the author of these PowerShell commandlets to display what they're doing, examples, what the parameters are, how to use it. This kind of information is usually found on the Microsoft Learn documentation library anyway. So if you were to search for get-az VM, you would be able to find the PowerShell documentation reasonably easy with these almost the exact same response. But if you're stuck in the zone, in the command line, you want to quickly know about something, the get help commandlet helps. So as you can see here, so it's getting the help of the get-az commandlet. And what this does, it gets the property of a virtual machine. So an Azure virtual machine. An example of how you would use this would be get-az and then the parameter of resource group name, where you will enter in where the resource group of that VM is sitting, and then the name of the virtual machine itself, so /test. And in this example, it's got back just an example virtual machine. So these are the type of PowerShell objects you'll get back based on that, based on this particular command that you will run. Another example is getting the status. So get-VM, grabbing the resource group, grabbing the virtual machine name, and then piping out status at the end of it. And then as you can see, it's giving you the status and provisioning has succeeded about that actual virtual machine as well. So the status of it. So if you were deploying something and you wanted to know if it was failed or succeeded or running, this would be a really good commandlet to use. And then, of course, you can get -az VM and then the resource group name, and that will give you a list of all the machines that are running. But the get help commandlet is very good to have, very good to know. So now we've installed the AZ PowerShell modules. We've gone through the get help. We've gone through the commands, trying to see what we can do, what items and resources we can use PowerShell with Azure and play around with, like, for example, get azvm will just get the resources and then give the information back about that resources back to the command line for you. So get is a really good to start playing around with. So anything with get means that you're not actually going to make any changes to the objects themselves. So get is really useful for starting out with PowerShell and Azure because you can get an object and know you're not making any changes to it. But first up, we need to authenticate to Azure. So we've got our AZ modules installed. We've got a plethora of things that we could do now, but first we need to actually connect to Azure in order to do that. So to do that, we use the connect-az account commandlet. Usually, if you were to type this in and enter it yourself, it will pop up with a username and password prompt. It will prompt you for MFA, so you can log in with your admin account that has rights to be able to do things in Azure, or a reader account if you just view things. But because I'm running this in a notebook, the interactive prompt of opening up the authentication prompt in the browser won't work. So in order to get around that, I can do the connect-az account and then use device authentication. And that will allow me to log on to Azure using another browser and code. So let's run that. So as you can see, to sign in, I need to open up a web page and then enter this code to authenticate. So I've already logged into Azure on another browser. I'm just opening that. Just bear with me. And go to the device log on, and then I enter in the code. I specify my account. I accept that I'm trying to log on to PowerShell, and then it said you have signed in to the PowerShell application. So I can now close that. And as you can see down here, I'm now being signed in. So if you notice these kernel errors, you can just ignore them. They're issues with the .NET kernel in this book. But the fix is usually to click on the PowerShell code down here and then select PWSH, so select PowerShell, but something in the back end of this particular cell is having trouble, so it's not outputting properly. But going in here and then reselecting PowerShell usually fixes the problem. But of course, I would have to rerun it again. But even though you can see the errors here, it's actually specified this is the account that I'm using to connect to Azure. This is the subscription that it's come up with, and the tenant ID, and the environment as well, which is Azure Cloud. If I had a service principal, so an application that I've created in Azure and then granted it the rights to make changes or read, usually service principals are used with automation. So being able to run reports, being able to use infrastructure as code. I could use this type of PowerShell to log into it. So I would grab the secure string, the tenant ID, the application ID. I would create a new credential using both the application, the security ID, and then I would connect using the service principal, and that allowed me to connect that way. But as you can see up here, I've connected to Azure and I've got one subscription listed, but I've got more than just that one subscription. I've got two. So let's take a look at what subscriptions I have access to with the get-az subscription commandlet. So let's run that. And as you can see, I've now got two subscriptions listed. One is a sponsorship and one is a Visual Studio. And then the ID of those subscriptions and the tenant ID, which is using the same tenant ID because they're both in my Enter ID tenant. So I can now connect to both of these Azure subscriptions if I wanted to. So to do that, I'm going to connect to my Visual Studio subscription. So I'm going to grab the ID from here, and then I'm going to enter it into here. So this will allow me to set the context of all my future commands that I'm going to run in PowerShell into this Azure subscription. So in order to do that, I'm going to pass the subscription ID into a variable, which will allow me to call it with the set-az context commandlet. So I don't need to use the variable here. I could just enter in the subscription ID in here, but having it as a variable means that it's really easy for me to change. So if I wanted to switch between this subscription and another subscription, I don't need to go down and change this here. I just change it in one place, especially when you've got lines of code. It makes no sense having to change it in every place. If I just change the sub ID in one place, it's changed in all the places. And then the $sign represents the variable name. So let me run that. And that has set my context. So my context is now the Visual Studio subscription. So let's see what we have. First off, we'll just comment this out. So instead of getting resources, we'll just get the resource groups and then format it as a table. So this is piping again. So this is grabbing all the resource groups that is in the subscription, and then it's piping it to the format table, which will format it as a table compared to, it could be a list. It could be quite a wide table. Format table can be a lot more easier to read, it's usually my go-to, but let's execute this cell. And as you can see, I've got a few resource groups here. And then because I formatted it as a table, I can see the resource group name, the location, and the provisioning state and tags. But now let's take a look at the resources. So I know there's resource groups that are in here. Is there any actual Azure resources in here? So let's grab those. And yes, there is. As I can see, there's a bunch of resources, and then it'll list the resource types as well, which is hidden at the moment because of the view. But there's a bunch of resources that I have in here in their resource groups. Let's get a bit more information. So in this example, I'm just formatting in a table. But what if I was to get that AZ resource, but without formatting it as a table? I've got a more of a list view. And in some cases, it's a bit more data as well. So as you can see here, I've got the name, the resource group name, the resource type. So I can easily see here the resource type for this. AZ Automation is an automation account. Any tags, where it's located, for example, Australia East, and everything like that, what the tags are. Every single resource that's within that subscription. So look, this is great. I can now see all the resources I have. I can now see all the resource groups I have. But what if I was only after one type of resource? An example is, I could be after virtual networks. So if I took the resource type here of Microsoft.compute-disks or virtual machines or dev test schedules, dev test lab schedules, what if I wanted only, to see virtual networks? What I can do is I can use the piping again. So I can get AZ resources, same command that we've just executed, but instead of just grabbing everything, I can pipe it to a where object. So where object allows me to filter it. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting the AZ resource, we're the object, and then this is essentially a pipe through of every object essentially. We're the resource type. So as we can see from when we got the AZ resource, the resource type here, where the resource type equals Microsoft.network/virtual networks. So if we execute this, we now have a list of 2 virtual networks. So instead of getting every Azure resource type under the sun, we only have the virtual network. So this allows me to filter more on the like this resource type could be location. It could be resource group name equals, so I can get everything under the same resource group. Location, name, but this, hopefully you can see here that, being able the where object is really useful to have for filtering resources. And always try to filter left as possible. What I mean by that is, at the moment, even though the where object is on the right hand side, we could have get AZ resource, we could have get AZ resource name, additional filters, and then we could be only filtering it at the end. But we still have to grab everything, so it still has to take the time to grab all the resources, filter it. Filtering as early as possible in your pipeline means that you're not grabbing stuff or spending time with the PowerShell engine executing what you need and what you don't need. So try and filter as left as possible. Hopefully that makes sense, but you don't want it doing more stuff than you need it to do. You don't want to start grabbing every resource group, every resource type, where only you need virtual networks. And this is just one example, but just try and filter as left as possible so you're not spending additional CPU cycles doing stuff that you don't need. So another example we can use using the get-az resource is sorting. So sort object by name. So in this example, we're using the same commandlet. So get-az resource, where object the resource type, instead of virtual networks, we're going storage account, and we're going to sort them by name. Then we're going to run it again and sort the objects by resource group name. So let's run that. So as you can see, we can get the Microsoft.storage storage accounts, and I've only got a couple of them, and they're sorted by name. So this storage account that's called func8ff2 is before SD, 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 S1. So this is listed first. And because I'm actually running 2 commands here, I'm also sorting objects by resource group name. The ones below here are sorted because they're in the same resource group. So an example is deployment environment. So it's grabbing all the resources that are in the same resource group and merging them together. So we can see this resource group is func dash, and so we can see there's a function app, storage account, a log analytics action group, anomaly, insights component, all within the same resource group. So we're just sorting the object by the resource group name. So working with variables, we touched on it before about instead of having to update every single thing in a script or every object for the same thing, we could just use a variable to do it. And variables are really useful when you're changing stuff, so you can output stuff to multiple variables and things like that. But in this case, we've got a variable here called resource type, and that equals Microsoft.network/virtual networks. And then we've got get-az resource where object resource type equals resource type. So instead of virtual networks as we had here, we're passing this. So let's run this. As you can see, it's taken the Microsoft.network string into our resource type variable, and then it's passing it through. So that's very useful because we don't have to have up every time we need to call the Microsoft.network resource types in our script. We don't need to go and update this in every single place. We just update in one place. So say for example today we're calling get all the virtual networks, and then tomorrow we're looking for Azure Automation accounts or storage accounts. Instead of going in and updating it in every place that this may exist in the script, we just update it here, run it, and then that will update for us. Another really useful thing with PowerShell is operators, and a useful one that I use all the time is count. So let's run this. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a variable called resources using the get-az command. So we already know if we run get-az resource, it will give us a list of all the resources. But now if we add it to a variable, that creates it into a PowerShell object we can do something with. So in this example, we're going to get the count. So we're going to go, if you store everything in the get-az resource commandlet into the resources variable, we can now use an operator called count to count how many resources that we have that have been stored in this variable, and then we're going to use write host, which will output a sentence or a message or anything that we have to your command line. And we're just going to say you have count, so the variable here is resources.count, resources in your Azure subscription. So if we run this, it should now come back with a list of all the Azure a count of all the Azure resources we have. So let's run this. So we have 32 resources in our Azure subscription, and we can see that because if we run the resources, that will give us a list of everything that we would have seen if we just run get-az resource, and then the count has created a dynamic variable because it's calling resources.count, and then that count is 32, and then we've written to host you have 32 because we're calling the variable here in our string. So we've gone you have 32 resources in your Azure subscription. And as you can see, this will update. So if I remove or add resources, this number will change live. Another thing we can do is loop. So using the get-az resource commandlet again, we can get-resource. We can add it to the resources variable. And then for each resource in that resources variable, if the resource type equals Microsoft.network/virtual networks, we can write a host, so write into the terminal exactly like this again. We found a virtual network with resource.name. So it will list the virtual network's name. And then we can write host again and say this virtual network is in the resource group name, and then the foreground color is green, so we can change the color of the prompt. So keep it when you imagine what you're thinking here. So resource.name, resource group name. So these are exactly the same as this. So this is a list of all the, because we're using the get-az resource, this is a list of all the things we could pull. So we could pull the name, we could pull the resource group, we could pull the resource group type. So it'd be $resource.location, $resource.type, resource type example. So let's run this. So as we can see, and hopefully you remembered, we only had 2 virtual networks. So it's ran this, and for each resource, so for each virtual network that it's found that matched this resource type, it's found a virtual network, and then its name, and then it's gone, this virtual network is in this resource group with a foreground color green. So SD VNet is in the SD group resource group, and then the second virtual network, so test VM-VNet, is in the test VM resource group. Another thing we can do is remember that get-az subscription commandlet. So we're connected to one subscription at the moment. So everything we're doing, so get-az resource, is getting it all in the same Azure subscription. What if we wanted to grab all the Azure resources from every subscription that I have access to? Let's run this. So we can go get-az subscriptions, add it to the subscription variable, which will add all the Azure subscriptions, and then for each subscription in subscriptions, so we could get the AZ resource where the object name equals virtual networks. So let's run this. And that's at the same error, but if we just do this again and then rerun it, as you can see, it's, I've forgot to change, but I've changed the background color and the foreground color as well. So as you can see, it's found the 2 virtual networks that we had earlier, and this was in our original subscription, and then we found another 2 virtual networks in the other subscription. So get-az subscription is really useful because it will tell you what subscription you're actually logged into, which is really useful, especially when you have access to more subscriptions than one. You don't want to go creating stuff in the wrong subscription, but especially if you're doing a report about all the type of resources that you have. For example, in this, it's going get all the virtual networks are in all the Azure subscriptions that I have access to. It's very handy to have. So it's connected to both of the Azure subscriptions that I have access to, and it's listed both of these here. Another thing that you can use as well is error handling. So try and catch is very useful syntax to know. So what this means is that we'll try something. So in this example, I'm going get-az resource group name. I'm giving it a name of a resource group that doesn't exist. And then I'm giving it an error action of stop. So if I get-az resource group name and then gave it a resource that existed, it wouldn't error. It would just come back with the resource group that I've linked it to. But because I've given it a resource group name that doesn't exist, and I've specified the error action as stop, that will run a catch. So you try one thing, if that doesn't work, you catch, and you can have something that tries another. And in this case, I'm using the right host again, but I'm going an error incurred in the error. Make sure you've selected the right resource group, and then the 4-color red. So try and catch is really good context to make. And as you can see, an error occurred with the resource group because this is the error that you're getting back from the original commandlet, could not be found. And then it's the operation ID, And then I've gone, make sure you have selected the right resource group, which is what I've added, and then the 4-color red. So try and catch is really useful, especially if you're starting out. You can use it to make something that's interactive. So say you're doing something for the service desk, or you're trying to start a virtual machine and someone's put in the name of a virtual machine that doesn't exist. You could use try, so get-azvm, and then you could go catch and post this virtual machine does not exist. Make sure you have the right information. Very, very useful, something to keep in mind. Right, thank you for sticking with me. It feels like I've been talking forever. 45 minutes according to the counter. But we're almost there. We're on to our second notebook now. So we've covered the introduction to Azure PowerShell, and we've used the get-az resource command like quite a lot. Next, we're going to actually create stuff. So assuming we're starting from scratch, we need to import the module first. There's a lot of times these days that you actually don't need to import the module because PowerShell will automatically know what commandlets you're trying to do and import it for you. But it's always worth doing it anyway, so then you know that the modules are imported, but that could just be an old way of dealing with it. So try with and without it, but I always try and import the module first. So importing the module brings the module into your own environment or workspace, so then you can now leverage all the commandlets that we've seen earlier. So once I put verbose on it, mainly so I can see whether it's working, but you don't need it. You can ignore the .NET kernel errors as well. That was due to something weird going on in the back end, but it has worked. So let's create our first resource group. So as we saw in the previous chapter, a lot of resources were already existing because they're my own Visual Studio Enterprise subscriptions that I test. So I've got a lot of resources already provisioned. But what if I wanted to create a new resource group? So instead of get-az resource, we're now on new-az resource group. So new will actually create a new resource group. So in this example, I'm going new-az resource group with the name of my resource group, and the location is West US. So let's run that. It shouldn't take very long. So that's now created a new Azure resource group in my subscription called my resource group, and the location it's been provisioned is West US. So that's created my resource group for me. A question that you may have is, look, how do you know the location is West US? Like, how do you know that that's what it is? How do you know it's not West US with no spaces? How do you know it's not lowercase? How do you know it's not West United States? It's a good question. And to answer that, we can use the get-az location commandlet. So this is quite a good commandlet because it will get all the Azure regions that are existing. So in the first case, I'm just going to comment this out. We're going to get az location. We're going to select object, but instead of selecting object by resource type or by name, we're just going to get the first one by the parameter of first and then 1. And this will spit out the first location that comes to us. So to give us an understanding of what kind of information we may be getting back from the get-az location. So location, East US, the display name, East US, it's a region, we can see the longitude and latitude, we can see the physical location of the data centers. Keep in mind, Microsoft does not publicly give an exact location on where the data centers are stored for security and privacy reasons. Obviously they don't want people turning up, but we can see the general location of the East US region is located in Virginia, and it's a recommended region, so it's not hidden, it's not a government region, it's just recommended to use. And then we can see the paired region of East US is West US. So what this means is if I was to create an Azure storage account in East US and I specify it as GRS, so geo-redundant, within the storage account, the paired region would be West US. So that means that I will have, if it's GRS for example, I will have 3 copies of the Azure storage account located in East US and then a copy in West US as well. So that means that if East US goes down or I lose connectivity, my paired region is West US. So Microsoft are moving away from paired regions more to 3+0. So 3+1, 3+2, being able to select your own paired region. In some cases, having East US paired to West US or Australia East to Australia Southeast makes sense. It's probably what you would do anyway, but there may be opportunities or chances where you go, oh, my stuff's in Australia, but I want to replicate this to West US instead, and allows you to select that region instead. But for now, we can see the paired region and the providers. So the providers are what services that region supports. So in this example, we can see that East US supports Azure App Services, Microsoft Insights, Alert Management, and a bunch, just about almost every other thing. So let's grab all the resource locations. So we're going to get AZ location, but we're not worried about longitude, latitude. We're not worried about the paired region. We just want to grab the display name. We want to grab the location, the physical location, and the geographic group. So is it, like, where is it? And then we want to format that by a table. So we're going to use the select object and then specify the fields in this object that we're going to get. So let's run that. As you can see, we're now getting the display name, we're getting the location, the physical location, and the geography group. So using this information, we can go, so location is West US. In here, we should be able to see West US somewhere. It's probably right in front of my, yep, here we are, West US. So if, for example, we wanted to create a resource group in Japan, we now know that we can use Japan. If we wanted to create it in Switzerland North, we now know what we can use and where those groups are located. And here's, like, I'm in New Zealand, so I create stuff in Australia East all the time. So for me, I'd be looking at the Asia Pacific geographic region on where to host things. So now that we know what locations we can specify and how they're written up, let's create a new resource group using a variable again. So the region equals Australia East. We've put it as a variable here, region. So we're going to go new-az resource group name. Then we're going to use my resource group, and then we're going to add the region variable to the end. And what this will do is this will link our string. Notice the double quotes here. That allows us to use the variable within it. If I was just to change this here, it would just print out my resource group $region. But because I'm using, the quotes, it allows me to run the variable within it. So what that will do is that will create a my resource group and then Australia East. So I'm using the variable in 2 places. One is the location and one is the name. So let's create that. So as you can see, it's now created a resource group called My Resource Group Australia East with the location of Australia East. And that's what I mean about the variable use. It's something I use all the time. Instead of going in and having Australia East here and Australia East here, I specify it here. That means if I then wanted to take the script and run it in another region, all I need to do is change that region variable, and then that will update it. So now we've created our resource group. Let's create a storage account within that resource group. So I'm going to show you a couple of different attempts at this, mainly so you know what happens when you come across an error, and these are common things that you might experience, especially when creating global resources like a storage account. So let's create a storage account here. So the region is Australia East again. Our resource group name is going to be the name of the resource group, so My Resource Group Australia East. We're going to go new-az storage account. We're going to have it in the resource group that we've just created. Its name is going to be My Storage Account. The location is going to be the region, so Australia East again. It's going to be standard LRS, so it's only going to be within one of the 3 availability zones in Australia. And we're going to set allow public access to false, mainly because that's a standard that Microsoft is introducing now. So it used to be when you created the new AZ storage account, public access would be enabled by default, but due to security measures, they're disabling that as a default parameter, and I've just added that in just to show you, and it will also give you a spiel about the changes, the breaking changes that are coming as well. So let's run this. And it's errored. So this is the upcoming breaking changes I was just talking about allow public access and cross-tenant replication. And the version of the AZ storage account that it's expected to change to be made in, and the AZ version as well. So we talked a while back about the update module commandlet. This is when you would go, right, let's grab the latest update modules, and then grab the latest there. And so when you're on a version of 11, as an example, this warning will not come up anymore because you're already running the latest version. But as you can see here, there's been an error. So new-az storage account. The storage account name, My Storage Account, is already taken. What this means is there are a few resource types in Azure that are globally unique, and a storage account is one of them because it has a public endpoint. So that means that you can use any computer over the internet to connect to mystorageaccount.blob.storage.windows.net, but that's unique. Like multiple people can't have mystorageaccount.blob. etc. So storage accounts are one of those services that it needs to be unique across the entire world, and that's where your naming convention for your Azure resources come into play. Because when you start going, insert company prefix, insert location of storage account, insert maybe what the storage account's used for, that's more unique to you. So what we're going to do to get around this is we're going to create a GUID. So GUID would just be a bunch of numbers and some hyphens, just a random set generated by the GUID method here from PowerShell. So we're going to create a new GUID, so a random string, and then we're going to select the first 4, so 0 to 4, because storage accounts have a limit in the amount of, I think it's 24 characters, but don't quote me on that, on the length of the storage account name. So we're only going to select the first 4 of the randomly generated GUID. We're going to keep the rest of it the same, but as the name, instead of my storage account, we're going to go my stg acc, and then we're going to add the unique ID that was created from the GUID to the end of it, and the rest of this is the same. So let's create our storage account now. And we wait. Now it shouldn't take too long. One thing I do like about the notebook is the ability to represent how long a commandlet takes. You can do this with measure-object. So if I was to create the new -az storage account and then at the end of here pipe it to measure-object, it would tell me how long it takes. Again, we ignore the kernel errors. This is really annoying, sorry guys. But we can see here that our storage account has been created. So the first 4 characters of our GUID is D7D2, and we can see they are my storage account. So this is a globally unique name. It's now created our storage account from us. So we've got our storage account now, and that's in our resource group that we've created. Now let's remove it. So to do that, we can use the remove-az storage account commandlet and then specify its resource group name and then its name as well. So the unique variable here, unique ID variable, is already passed through to my session up here. So I can just call the same variable. So these 4 characters here, which will give us the name of the resource group and then of the storage account, sorry, and that will allow us to remove it. And then at the end, I'm just adding a get to make sure that it's removed. So let's run this. So it's performing the operation remove on target. My storage account ACCD7D2. Let's see if this will clean it up. And it doesn't exist, so because it's been removed. So this has successfully removed our storage account. What if we wanted to do something a bit more advanced or more involved? An example of this is creating a virtual network. So we've got our variables up here. We've got our variable of region, which is Australia East. We've got our resource group name, which is network-prod-rg. We've got our VNet name, so our virtual network name, which is VNet-prod, our subnet name, and then our subnet prefix. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use the get-az resource group name. So it's looking for network-prod.rg. And if this doesn't exist, if this resource group doesn't exist, then it will have a null value assigned to it. So what I'm saying here is if the resource group comes back with nothing, so it's empty, there's no resource group, then create the resource group for me. So we're going to write host creating resource group name in region, foreground color yellow. And then we're going to replace that variable of resource group with new resource group dash name, resource group name, region force, because we're going to be using the resource group name in our new Azure Virtual Network. So if we get this and it doesn't exist, it will add it into us. So let's create our resource group. If it doesn't exist, which it doesn't because I've deleted it in the term, it will create our resource group for us. If it already exists, it will just say it already exists and then continue on with the rest of the script. So let's go ahead, and I think I spot an error with this, but we'll just run this. So yeah, the network-prod-rg doesn't exist. So it errored, and I think the problem is resource group name is because this should actually be let's run this. Okay, so it's created the resource group for me, and then I'll put resource group name dot. Let's try this. The argument is empty. Resource group get ID, so we got resource group. Sorry for this, guys. I think. Oh, okay. It's tried to create the resource group already. And this is about the interactive prompt again. I think it might have done it, but we'll just push force at the end of it. So instead of prompting me, do I want to override the resource, it will just go ahead and do it for me. Cool, and that's completed. So yeah, there was an issue there with the wrong variable, and yeah, that's sorted. And then it prompted for the interactive prompt of do I want to override it, which I can't do in the notebook. So I've just added force, which essentially overrides that interactive prompt. And so it says resource group network already. And so we'll just step away from when I find it, step away from sorry, I'm just opening up the Azure portal because I realize I actually haven't shown you just bear with me. I've got the window somewhere. My browser is not playing. It's because I've got this logged in. But what I can see is just bear with me. Sorry guys, I know this is taking a while. I'm just trying to find here it is here. So we can see our network dash prod arg. We can see our virtual network here. And we can see our no subnet. So it hasn't created the subnet for us. So let's troubleshoot that. Why has it not created our subnet? So add virtual network. Let's just run this. I'll come back to that. Let's go to, right, we're almost at the end anyway. But we've created our virtual network. It just hasn't created the subnet. So I need to check on this. I think I've made changes to the notebook, but I obviously must have overwritten the changes that I made on the working copy, but I'll come back to that at the very end. So another thing to be aware of with PowerShell is aliases. So in this example, I'm getting the resource group, the virtual network we've just created using the get-az virtual network. So we're getting the virtual network in the resource group and the name. So we already know the VNet name because we specified that earlier when we created the VNet. And we're going to pipe it to FL. So this is an alias, so a short code for format list. So instead of typing format-list at the end, it's like this, we can just go FL. So let's run this. So this gives us exactly the same kind of response we would have if we'd had a format list. So there's a few things like get member. So get-member or GM is another alias that's really worthwhile. And this is really bad test, but get member will almost give you back everything about that. Oh, it's because this. I was commenting out the pipeline. So get member will give you every single object parameter output. So for example, for get AZ virtual network, for the VNet we've just created, we can look up the address space, we can look up the encryption, the DDoS protection, DHCP options, location. So get member is another alias, and then if we go back to FL again, it will format as a list, which is the same output. Some of the aliases, so get-alias will tell you the aliases you can use. I'm just going to grab the first two as an example, but another alias we can use is, so instead of where object, so get alias is where object, name, like, name equals. Instead of typing where object, we could actually just use the question mark. And so instead of for each object, so for each subscription in subscriptions, we could use the percentage sign as well. I don't recommend doing this for production scripts. It's much easier to read what the scripts are actually doing when you're using where object, when you're using for each object, than having some of the aliases thrown in like FL or question mark or $sign, but it's really useful to know, especially when you're wanting to shortcut what you're working with. The last concepts that I'm going to show you is splatting. So previously we've used variables to define what the VNet name is, what the resource group name is, things like that. But what we're going to do here is splat it. So we've created a hash table called config data. So this object, this table, represents the resource group name, which is called my resource group name. The location is West US, and the storage account name is storage account test 100. And when I tested this earlier, this storage account name didn't exist, so it should create it automatically. But what we're doing here is we're going to use the try and catch again. So we're going to try creating a new Azure storage account with the resource group name of config data dot resource group name. Then the name of the storage account is going to be config data dot storage account name. So we're looking in the hash table for every row specifying the value of that. So instead of having it as multiple variables, which you could do as well, you could just have it all as one table and then reference each one individually. So let's create that. And we wait for it to create. While that creates, we'll just go to the next one because this is creating the storage account. So we'll go to splatting as a parameter. So there we are, it's created our storage account for us. So we've specified here the table data, the hash table data, and then the output of those rows. So storage account name is going to be this, because this is what we specified here in the input for the new -az storage account commandlet. Another thing we could do, instead of having name and location and SKU name all as separate entities here, we could actually use the table to fill that in, and this is called splatting. So our resource group, so we've got commas wrapped around the perimeter, so resource group name, the location, the storage account name, and the SKU name. So these are identical to what we passed in earlier. So we've got resource group name equals my resource group name, location West US, storage account name, storage account test 100, LRS. So this is going to fail because our storage account already existed here, but I'm going to run that. Yeah, it's already taken, but as you can see here, it already knows, like, it knows what the resource group name is, it knows what the location is, it knows what the storage account name is. It's, by just passing it the table, it's automatically looked for its parameters in the table and found them. If we were to just chuck a random number on here, it's going to create the, yep, it's taking its time. So it looks like storage account test 103 doesn't exist, so it's about to create it for us. Cool, we're almost at the end, guys. Sorry this has taken longer than I anticipated, but hopefully you're learning something from it. And if there's anything that I can answer or do a video of in the future, definitely let me know. Hopefully shorter ones. I was almost going to split this into two videos. I now think that I should have, but we'll see how this goes. So the last things I want to cover is tags. So in Azure, you can tag resources. So you can tag resources based on the application type, the business owner, whether or not the resources can be resized or shut down. Tags are your governance layer. So we're going to create a new resource group called tag test RG. Its location is going to be Australia East, and after we've created that new resource group, we're going to tag it. So the tags are going to be department equals finance and project equals Q1. So let's run this. So we're going to go to the new AZ resource group to create the resource group, and then we're going to set AZ resource group, so modify it with the tag value in this array. So let's run this. So it's created our resource group for us, and then it's created our tags. So that's really useful to know, and it's always recommended to tag your resources. Now we need to get them. So say you're automating something and you want to grab the tags on a resource group because you want to make sure that a tag is set. Like you want to automate something if you're the only one who's an owner of it. So the tag is application owner equals Luke Murray. You could use the get-az resource group commandlet, and then the resource group names, and then just dot tag. So you're essentially looking up the tags value of the get of the resource group object. So let's run this. As you can see, we can see that the tag test RG resource group has name and value tags of department, which is finance, and the project, which is Q1, which I've just added earlier. Now, if we wanted to remove a tag, so say we're not happy with the project being Q1, this is now in production, it's no longer a project, we can remove that. So we can use the same commandlets that we did earlier by grabbing the object and then the values of that object of the tag, and then we can just go, you can use a method called remove. So we're going to remove the tag of project. And then once that's done, we will set this tag's object as true. So we're going to update the tags with what we're going to remove here. So let's update this. And as you can see, it's now updated the resource group by removing the tag object. If we go back to that virtual network, I was able to get it to work by adding the subnet and then adding it to the AZ VNet object and then setting it. So it was adding it to the object, but it actually wasn't adding the subnet in, making it create until I use the set-AZ virtual network over the AZ VNet object. So it's very similar to what we've just done with the tags, but I now have my infraservice subnet created. So thank you for staying with me throughout this video. Hopefully you've learned something. Mention in the comments below anything you want me to cover in the future. Maybe something I didn't cover enough that you want to know about. Maybe you're looking for scripts for something. Here to help. But yeah, thank you for staying with it, and hopefully you've learned something. And yeah, take a look at Polygon notebooks. Bye.